We have been kicked off last week doing the Barefoot Disciple, and our small groups kicked it off this term. The name is obviously leveraged off the Barefoot Investor marketing, but I said last week they're not. It's really a marketing leverage rather than a similarity between the two. Well, there are similarities too. Frank, you've read both, and you've had thoughts on both. But tell us a little bit about the differences between Barefoot Investor and Barefoot Disciple.
Yeah, sure. So Barefoot Investor, like they're both kind of like, they take you on a journey. They both do that. They both free you from something. So I think the Barefoot Investor frees you from the anxiety of budget management, like makes it very easy to do. And then it takes you on a journey towards a comfortable retirement, basically. Right. Like many steps in between, but it's a very, that's what that thing does.
I was talking to Ken last week. He's a financial advisor, as many of you know, and he was talking about the idea of a budget being more freeing than what people often think. It's like, I don't want to have to do the extra admin, but actually knowing where you spend your money frees you. Yeah,
it's like there is certainly a lot of anxiety when we think about money and stuff like it, and it's often in the too hard basket, and so we kind of go, it's too hard, no, let's not think about it ever, and just have this black box of a bank account there, like doing whatever it does. Yeah. So having visibility of it is really fantastic. Yeah. So to compare it to the Barefoot Disciple, it also takes you on a journey, and it also frees you. It frees you from your own selfishness. It frees you from consumerism, and it takes you on a journey towards, I would say, shrewd spending. Like how to best use the power that God has given you in finances for yourself, for your family, for God's kingdom, etc.
It's interesting talking that language of journey, because most people I've been chatting to about it have not liked the first two chapters of Barefoot Disciple. The journey doesn't start well for a lot of people. Was that your experience?
Yeah, it certainly was. Like we did the first two studies in our Connect group before I started reading the book, and it felt very prescriptive. And a lot of those little tips that they gave, the habits that they gave at the start of the book, wasn't aligning with what I was thinking. But when I read further into the book, I discovered that actually it's not just prescribing stuff for me to do. It's actually trying to get me to think differently in my heart about how I deal with money, how I should treat money. Because what generally happens with money is that, especially like, what generally happens is that we feel like locking away from God. Like it's this, yes, I'm Christian, I'm all on fire for you, I want to live your way, I have faith in you, I want to serve at church. Money, it's mine. Like it's I've earned it, it's my hard earned. Like it's not yours, God. Like we won't say that out loud, but deep in our hearts, I think that a lot of us have this little thing tucked away in there. So I think the book kind of sometimes in a sledgehammer way, sometimes in a more gentle way.
Especially at the beginning.
Yeah.
Much more sledgehammer at the beginning.
Yeah, very ugly sledgehammer. It tries to rewire your heart in a way where you think about how to best use the resources that God has given you for things that has eternal implications.
Yeah. Marissa, can we get those, they're just the habits up on the screen, because you mentioned them, Frank, but there are 5 habits it talks about. And the first 2, which we preached through, first one last week, we're going to do give habitually today. It does feel like you're thrown in the deep end, and then he teaches you to swim later on, which for swimming, not advised. Maybe, I don't know, for money. There's a method there, and that's, most people feel like they warm up to it as the book goes on.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I certainly warmed up to it. I think I was leading my Connect group down the garden path of hatred towards the author in the first 2 weeks. And then when I started seeing the nuances in the book, I was far more on board with the sort of principles behind it, which is to shrewdly live for the kingdom, like not just and not just to unthinkingly let the world decide what to do with our hard-earned cash in a way.
Yeah. I've said this before, but one of the journeys that I've taken on this is just the encouragement that the slope of greed pulls on us all the time. So talking about money is such a critical thing, and we often don't want to talk about it, but it impacts our spiritual life. The topic, so you read Barefoot, you didn't just read Barefoot Investor, you actually did a lot of work to restructure some of your finances around it. If someone was thinking around that space, like they're interested in thinking more, what would you say about reading the Barefoot Investor?
I reckon do it, because it certainly helped me and my family do our budget management. So we've been using it to organise our finances since 2020. It's just very it takes a bit to set up, but once it's set up, it's very easy to manage in an ongoing manner, and it helps you to save money and pay off debts and not feel guilty about spending on yourself as well, in just a very helpful way. So for the last 6 years, we've been using it to just manage the family budget, I think in a healthy way.
Yeah, great. And as you said, it kind of leads towards how you get to a comfortable retirement. Barefoot Disciple wants to push past retirement to eternity. If someone's kind of thinking about that space and how they apply disciple principles to their money, what would you say about the Barefoot Disciple?
Yeah, I think like we all every now and then need to kick up the bum in terms of how we see our money, and even though Barefoot Investor is really good at helping you see the wisest choices in finances from the world's perspective, well, like we as Christians, we're wired. We should be wired differently. We should have different priorities to the average person reading the Barefoot Investor. So, like, I guess the book asks you the questions of, well, what are the priorities? And I think where it eventually leads to is like is shrewd investment or kingdom investment, that sort of thing. So that can look quite different for a lot of people. Like it could be, for some people, it's trying to find a Christian business to spend your money on, or to. But it's more about adding a God filter or a Jesus filter before we click a Black Friday deal or a Christmas deal, or just adding that extra step of, okay, is this the best use of what God has given me? Like in terms of, do I maximize my investment returns with murder, death, oil, seal murdering company, or do I actually go an ethical route that has less returns but better outcomes for the seals and stuff?
Yeah.
Like
those seals.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I find really helpful about the book is that, so you look at the pathway. We often, when we talk about money, from a church perspective, it's like we feel guilty for not giving enough or sacrifice more. And the book starts with a pretty heavy, like really be brutal about how much luxury we actually live in, which is a very uncomfortable place. But what I love about it is those next steps is, especially we'd start thinking about spend missionally. It's starting to think about not just are you feeling guilty enough about not giving enough, but actually what about your spending? What about your lifestyle? How is that being missional? And how all those things dovetail together. And so this week we're going to look at giving habitually, then we're going to have compassion next week, and quite literally have an opportunity to give beyond ourselves in that space. And then the last 2 weeks we're going to think about spending and saving stewardly, so stewarding. So thanks. Would you join with me in thanking Frank? One of the things we've said as we think about talking about money for a few weeks is that this is a faith-raising exercise, not a fundraising exercise. The difficulty is that both those things coexist at the same time. In fact, I don't know if you noticed it this morning, but we've got Share the Joy, asking for giving to Toys and Tucker for Christmas. We've got Compassion coming next week, and we haven't started to talk about it yet, but towards the end of this, as we come to the end of the year, we'll be thinking about pledging towards next year's financial budget. So these two things exist. We both talk about financial matters and we talk about spiritual matters at the same time. We just read this passage in 2 Corinthians 9, and those two things exist in that same tension there. In fact, in one sense, it's a great passage to read and think about when thinking about giving, because in one sense, Paul is already preaching to the choir, so to speak, when he writes to the church. You look at some of the wording he says, verse 1 and 2, he says, I don't need to tell you about giving. You're eager to help, he said. In fact, he says, I've been boasting about you. In fact, he says the Macedonians were so inspired by you, they started to give. So, in one sense, Paul is not writing to this church to tell them you must give. And yet, at the same time, he's reminding them about a giving opportunity they committed to a year ago. And he's communicating the way that's going to happen. It almost reads a little bit passive-aggressive. You know, I don't know if you got that, but he goes, you guys are great givers. But, verse 3, just in case I'm wrong, I'm sending some brothers, probably big guys, to make sure and get you ready. You know, it feels like the mafia is going to knock on the door and make sure that gift that you generously from the heart give is going to be prepared. I'm confident that's not the case because of the way Paul talks all the way through it, and he finishes even that section at the end of verse 5. He says, we want this to be a willing gift, not one giving grudgingly. What's happening here is Paul can't shoot off an email saying, hey, how's that going? How are you doing with this fundraising exercise? What's happening there? And so he has to send messengers, because even if he sends a letter, it means sending messengers. And so that's what's happening here. And so as far as we can tell, this is a genuine community of generosity. And Paul's writing to them. But at the same time, he wants to take the time to speak to the heart of generosity. And one of the things we see here is the habit of giving helps break the heart of greed. There's a pattern that we can set up in our lives that can really help us wrestle with a heart of greed. Throughout Scripture, it's clear that time and time again, God's people wrestle with this heart of greed. And Jesus talks about that challenge of you can't serve two masters. That is, the master of money and greed is constantly can be pulling on us, and we need to make sure our hearts are focused on Jesus. And that's what Paul wants to do here. And so I want to think about two things that he tells us to help us think about the habit of giving. The first one is that our attitude activates our giving. Our attitude activates our giving. It impacts our giving, our attitude, and how we think about this thing. In fact, more specifically, Paul says intentional planning helps combat greedy impulse. The intentionality and putting things in place will help us with a greedy impulse. He tells us here that he's been boasting about this planned giving, and it's clear that the church in Corinth has planned giving. In fact, he said in verse 2, you were ready to send an offering a year ago, he says. So this is a planned giving, but it seems more than it's just a planned one-off giving, because when we look at his letter, his first letter, 1 Corinthians, he very explicitly tells them to do it as a weekly collection. So this is what he told them in 1 Corinthians 16. You should follow the same procedure I gave to the churches in Galatia. On the first day of each week, you should each put aside a portion of the money you have earned. So what Paul has encouraged them to do here is planned, intentional giving, putting this money aside so that it might build up and be a blessing to, in particular, in this scenario, the church in Jerusalem is what they're doing. But there's something helpful about having that habit of intentional, planned giving. And it helps combat our greed impulses. And we know that we have impulses. We know that we have impulses that undermine our greatest planning. I remember, many years ago, back when I used to exercise, many years ago, in school days, I used to go running with a friend in the morning. I know that if the scenario when I say, I'm going to go for a run tomorrow morning, I'll set my alarm. When the alarm went off in the morning, I would say, running can wait, I've got more important things to do right now. That is more sleep. If I plan to meet with someone out on the corner in the cold early in the morning and I set an alarm for that, totally different situation, right? There's something about the intentionality of that plan that actually holds me accountable to that. And so when the alarm goes off, while I might have the same feelings towards getting out of bed in the morning, there's another layer in there, and that is someone else is relying on me. And so sometimes thinking about how we be intentional with our planning helps us fight some of those impulses that come. And we've all experienced that in our best moments we say, I'm going to do this. It's the New Year's resolutions, right? There's a saying, may your problems last as long as your New Year's resolutions. That idea that they don't last very long, and hopefully your problems don't last long. But if you set things in place and hold accountability, we can be much more effective in that. And so we're encouraged to give regularly, make it a habit of giving. When we think about budgeting, we talk about budgeted spending, is kind of setting aside the money that you need to spend on the things you need to spend on. Well, the habit of giving is budgeted giving. It's setting aside the money that you're going to give so you have it there to give. One of the challenges of the book of the Barefoot disciple is early on in those first two chapters when he's talking about that sort of thing, and he gives examples. Often people's reaction to that seems to be it's too legalistic, or even that the giving that's suggested isn't generous enough, and we might be encouraged to be more generous. Part of what he's saying is just find a way to start. So we start off with pull back in our luxurious lifestyle and live simply. But his next step of giving habitually, making it a habit, is to just start. Start giving. His suggestion, we're going to have compassion next week, but he gives the suggestion, get a sponsor child and start to make that something you do, putting money aside for someone in that way. He says allocate an amount of money that you would give to your church and just start doing that and make it a habit. Get that going. We've talked a lot in recent times about the change in the way we handle money, and particularly as we think about less cash in our society. And at this service, we don't pass around an offertory container of any kind anymore. We have a box at the back, and most people give online. And we've said and found that if you're going to have intentional planned giving, then actually setting up automatic payments is a really easy way to do that. Not because it's set and forget, and we want to be careful of that because we still want it to be intentional, but it is something that we can set up so that we can make it something that we do as part of our lifestyle, as a habit. Intentional helps to combat impulse. A cheerful heart helps to combat the reluctance that comes with generosity. Paul says this to the church, verse 7. He says, you must each decide in your heart how much to give. And don't give reluctantly or in response to pressure, for God loves a person who gives cheerfully. It's an interesting concept that we have a command to give cheerfully. Like that kind of doesn't work, right? To say, command someone, you've got to do this, and also you've got to do it happily. I mean, you try to say that to your kids, right? You say, go clean your room and be happy about it. It doesn't quite land like that. It's interesting to try to process that. We see it with, with young children trying to learn to share. It's really difficult to teach really young children to share because really young children haven't even got kind of to the social development age where they play together, right? Really young children play side by side. And so the idea of sharing a toy isn't really sharing a toy for young children. It's playing with one toy and letting them play with another. It's one of those things I think you kind of almost analysing the human heart. You watch the nature of a child playing with a toy and another kid comes and plays with a different toy, and the first child suddenly decides that different toy is where their heart's desire is and not the toy they had, and you have that moment where it's like, I need all the toys, not just my toys. There is an instinct to us that goes against generosity, but we're encouraged here in that same way of trying to teach a child to share. We're encouraged to give in a cheerful way. And it almost sounds like it's an opposite thing. How do we give cheerfully? Well, just like Paul tells us that the attitude activates our giving, the impact of our giving inspires our giving. The impact inspires our giving, and that helps us move towards a much more cheerful heart. We see it all the way through this passage, and we can kind of see the illustration of it in our lives. You can see the joy of giving a gift to a child by the way it impacts them. I saw a video recently of the video was titled "The Perfect Gift for a Child Who Loves Rocks." And they had a box of just garden rocks, and this toddler comes out, and you can tell it's a great gift by the way the toddler responds to his garden rocks. He takes two of them just in awe of them and holds them up for everyone else to see, his rocks. And so what seems like at first a bit of that's not a great gift, immediately realise it is a great gift because of the impact it has on him. And it becomes a joy to the giver. One, because rocks are really cheap, and two, most importantly, because of the joy that it gives them. And the impact inspires the giving. And we see a similar thing here. In fact, we see it the way Paul plants this farming illustration right in the middle of this language about giving. If you look in chapter 9 there with me, 2 Corinthians 9, we read this, verse 5, he says, I want it to be a willing gift, not one given grudgingly. And then the very next verse, verse 6, he plants this farming illustration. He says, remember this, a farmer who plants only a few seeds will get a small crop, but the one who plants generously will get a generous crop. And then he jumps out of that back into the cheerful language and says you must each decide in your heart how to give. God loves a cheerful giver. You see what's going on there? He's talking about this cheerfulness, then he talks about planting generosity and goes back to cheerfulness. The picture here is the impact that comes from the generosity that is planted will help inspire the attitude towards the generosity. Giving is not a transaction. We see this picture of planting and harvesting, but giving is not a transaction. You don't give to someone so they will give to you. That might be you do exchange presents at Christmas time, but you're not giving them so they will give to you. It's not paying for a product and you give money so that you can get the product. That's not what generosity is. It's not a transaction, but it is an interaction. There is something that happens there. The reality is it's not always a rewarding interaction. There is some generosity we experience in our life that is quite a heavy sacrifice, that you give to someone who doesn't seem to appreciate it. There's times where we give to things where we don't get to see the impact of it, and we might be confident there is one, but we don't actually get to experience it. But giving is rewarding in healthy relationships where there is an exchange of love and gratitude. Giving is rewarding in healthy Christian ministries where you get to see the impact. Giving is rewarding in giving towards healthy social justice causes and opportunities to care for the needy. It's not a transaction, but it is an interaction. And so Paul draws on that idea of the impact of our giving in this idea of planting and harvesting. In fact, Paul has already given us an example of it, that if we plant generosity, we get to harvest generously. He gave us the example there in verse 2, right from the start. He said, "It was your enthusiasm that stirred up the many Macedonians believers to begin giving." Right from the beginning, Paul has given us the example of the church that planted generosity, and they saw an impact of their planting. And so as we plant generosity, as we generously plant generosity, we might see an impact. In fact, Paul says there is both physical and spiritual impacts, both physical and spiritual harvesting that we might see because of our giving. He points out that it's a partnership with God. Once again, I think we need to be really careful in this space that we don't see it as some sort of transaction with God, that God gives us what we want because we gave generously, or God gives us the things, the wealth for us because we gave our wealth away. I think we want to be careful not to see it as a transaction, but it is a partnership. That as God cares for us and God provides for us, we also care for others and give to others. And there's a partnership there. This is what he said in verse 8. God will generously provide all you need, and you'll have plenty left to share. I think we want to also say in that God is also providing and growing a heart of contentment. As we think about that idea of God providing all we need, it's important for us to think about what the idea of our needs are. Because I think it's really tricky that we very quickly move the spectrum, the idea of need becomes a spectrum, and that somewhere over here is want and somewhere over here is need, and we figure out somewhere where that slider should go. And very quickly, we start to declare things that we want as things that we need. If we're to be really clear on what we need, like I said in the interview with Frank, we want to think beyond just things like what a good retirement is. God wants us to look into eternal perspective. And in eternity, the only thing we need is a right relationship with Jesus. In fact, if we are satisfied in that one true eternal need, we will see much more contentment in the other places where we feel like we are lacking in our lives. And yet, even in that, Jesus talks about it and Paul talks about that God is one who provides seed for the sower. God is one who does provide physically, and everything we have that we live off has come from God's generosity. And so he says in verse 10, God will produce a great harvest of generosity. You'll be enriched in every way, he says, so that you can always be generous. We see there both the physical of providing for needs, but also the spiritual reward. That we're getting a great harvest, not of produce, but of generosity. That God is growing in us our own heart of generosity. So you'll be rich in every way so that you can be even more generous. Giving is truly worship. And like worship, it is both joyful and it is also a sacrifice. It is an act of obedience. It is responding to what God has called us to, and it's an act of relationship as we seek to live out our life with Him. There's both a physical and a spiritual harvest for us. We see that impact in our lives, and there's a physical and spiritual harvest in others. We see that impact in their lives. In fact, Paul spells that out quite explicitly. He says, verse 11, end of verse 11, when we take your gifts to those who need them, they will thank God. So we see a spiritual impact in them. And then he spells it out, verse 12. So 2 good things will result from this ministry of giving. 1, the needs of the believers in Jerusalem will be met, a physical impact. And 2, they will joyfully express their thanks to God, a spiritual impact. Both those things happen as impact. And so we want to think about that. One of the things I think really helpful in the Barefoot Disciple book is thinking about, as the book goes on, more and more thinking about how you see the most impact from your giving and from your spending, and actually taking places, actually assessing how we give and spend in a way that generates real impact in people's lives, and thinking beyond just it's giving it away to actually it's seeking to give in a way that's effective and helpful. And so we want to think about how we have a physical impact in this world. And so giving to places like giving to the poor, giving to the needy, is a way that we do that. One of the things that my house has found really helpful is early on, I can't take credit for this, this was Susie drove this, but both our kids, we got them a sponsor, we call them a sponsor sibling. So they're compassion sponsor child, but they're both the same age as our children, so we got them when our children were young, and they're the same age as our children, and we've had our children write letters to them and interact to them, and we teach them the impact of what they do, so that we see that impact of the physical in their life. Similarly, I think when we had the Kenyan choir come, and some of us had them stay in our houses, and the value with our kids to just see and be reminded how much we have and how little they have, and the reminder of what impact our giving can give to others who are in need. These things inspire joy in us. And so we see a physical harvest. We also see spiritual harvest in people's lives. In fact, as much as possible, when we can pair up giving to physical needs to giving to spiritual needs, as much as we can pair that up is the way we can get the most out of our giving. And so finding organisations that pair up both caring for people spiritually and caring for people physically is a helpful way to increase the impact of our giving. I remember years ago I was talking to a guy who had been through a number of years of he was on the poverty line and he was needing help. And one of the things was, he said, I always picked and choose where I went for help based on the guys that didn't force me to listen to their Christian stuff. He didn't use the word stuff. And so that idea that he was like, I don't want to hear that stuff, so I wouldn't go to those places that made me listen to Christian stuff, and they just gave to me freely. And it's tricky. It's a tricky space, isn't it? Like, we try to love people generously, and the most generous love we can give anyone is to share with them the greatest joy of all, which is life in Jesus. And how do we do that in a space with someone who just outright refuses to hear that? And yet, as much as possible, when we compare those two things up, we are sharing the eternal gift at the same time as sharing a physical gift. Let me finish with this. The heart of the matter is a matter of the heart. It's a well-used phrase by preachers, and it's so true when it comes to giving. Giving is a ministry of grace. It's a ministry of God's grace, because God's grace is the cause. It is because of God's grace that we want to be a giving people, because he gave to us. It is because of the relationship that has been enabled through Jesus' sacrifice that we might be friends with God that makes us want to live a life of sharing with other people. And God's grace is the source of our giving. Our giving is like a tap, right? When you turn on a tap, the tap doesn't magically produce water. That's not how a tap works. The water is already there. There is a source that provides it to the tap, and we are just allowing the source to flow through the tap. The same thing is true as we think about giving. We're not called to be a dam of God's gift that gathers around and holds it in some kind of body of water so that we have it all. We're much more called to be a waterfall of God's grace, where God's grace flows over us and out into those around us. So God's grace is the source, and God's grace is the ultimate gift we can give. A relationship with God is far above anything else. It is the eternal need. And God's grace transforms hearts. As we think about the spiritual impact of generosity on others, it is also a spiritual impact of generosity on ourselves, that God is transforming our heart. There's that passage where Jesus says in Luke 12, he says, "Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will be also." And two things are happening there. One of them is it's kind of a litmus test on where your treasure is. If you look where your heart is, if you look at where you're investing, that'll tell you a little bit about where your heart is. But the opposite is true as well. As we invest in God's kingdom, he grows in us a heart for his kingdom. And as those two things happen, our joy of generosity will grow hand in hand. Giving helps release the grip of greed by helping us treasure Jesus even more. Let me pray.